The metallic snap of the heavy iron latch breaking under the crowbar was the only clean sound left in the room. It was 14 inches the afternoon, on a suffocating Tuesday in October, and the air inside the Lake Gaston cabin smelled of dry pine, lake water, and machine grease. 30 people, contractors in mud-stained boots, local real estate flippers with plastic clipboards, and neighbors who had come merely to watch the carcass of my family's history get carved up, held their breath. Harold stood behind the makeshift podium. He had dragged onto the cedar deck, his hand wrapped tight around a walnut gavel. The wood was dark, heavy, polished by the oils of his own palms. He had just raised it, his chest swelling beneath a linen shirt. He had bought to look like the sort of man who owned bank branches instead of small-town concrete plants. His son, Richard, worked the floor below him, a digital tablet balanced on his forearm, his fingers tapping a rhythmic, impatient beat against the screen. The listing was his. The transfer forms were his. The whole machine of the sale ran through Richard's hands, while his father presided above it like a judge. They were 3 seconds away from the final call, 3 seconds away from converting 40 years of timber, water, and my father's sweat into a corporate wire transfer. Then, the iron latch gave way. The sound did not echo. It hit the low timber rafters and stopped dead. A dense, mechanical thud that belonged to ordnance, not to family real estate. In the sudden vacuum of noise, Harold's arm remained suspended in the humid Carolina air. The color did not leave his face all at once. It drained from his jawline first, leaving the gray stubble there looking like ash. He looked down at the floorboards, then over the heads of the crowd, toward the corner where the old floor safe, buried beneath 30 years of linoleum and forgotten braided rugs, had just been pried open. I did not lower my cane. I did not shift my weight from my left hip. Where the titanium pins, from a 2011 night drop over the Hindu Kush, still caught the damp weather before the clouds even gathered over the lake. I simply stood by the cold stone fireplace, my fingers resting lightly on the leather-wrapped handle. To explain why that latch opened, I said, my voice cutting through the silence, without rising above the pitch of the ceiling fan's low hum. I need to take you back to the day the water in the well turned gray. If you have ever had to stand quietly while someone dismantled your life, you know exactly why I waited. My name is Martha. I am 51 years old. If you saw me at the hardware store in town, or sitting on the bench outside the marina with a thermos of black coffee, you would notice 2 things. The slight, hitching drag of my right heel across the gravel, and the fact that I do not look at people when they talk. I look at their hands. For the past 3 years, since the government decided my lungs had taken in enough copper dust from burnt wreckage to warrant a permanent pension, I have lived in a 4-room cottage, 3 miles downriver from the main lake houses. It has no view. The cedar siding is gray from 30 years of river fog, and the only garden I keep is a patch of wild fern that grows without my permission under the kitchen window. I like it because it requires nothing from me. After 22 years as an Air Force combat rescue officer, after 400 hours of measuring my life by the remaining oxygen in a steel tank, or the seconds it took for a winch line to clear a canopy of burning pine, a quiet room is not a luxury. It is a preservation tactic. My mother, Miriam, called it my stubborn smallness. She spent 20 years believing I lived this way because the military had emptied me out. You have all those ribbons in that cigar box, Martha, she would say, her fingers busy mending an old dish towel that had already lost its hem. But you live like a woman who is still hiding from the draft. I let them believe it, I told her once, watching the way her knuckles had grown thick from the arthritis she never complained about. I never corrected that assumption. It was simpler that way. In the civilian world, people want a story they can fit into a 5-minute conversation at a church picnic. They want to hear about the uniform. Or they want to hear about the trauma. They do not want to understand the gray space between the two, where you realize that the most dangerous thing you can do in a small town is let people know exactly how much weight you are trained to carry before your spine breaks. But there was one detail I kept from her. One detail that stayed hidden beneath the lining of my old flight jacket. I did not hate the noise of the town. I did not hate the loudness of the world. I was simply waiting for the ink on my father's final military covenant to dry. At 2:40 inches the morning, 3 weeks before the auction. The cottage was entirely silent, except for the rhythmic grinding of metal on metal. I sat at the small oilcloth table in the kitchen, a single unshaded 60-watt bulb swinging slightly from the ceiling wire. In front of me lay my father's vintage green Stanley thermos. The steel was dented near the base, from where it had tumbled down a rocky embankment in the Huachuca Mountains 40 years ago. I took a rag dipped in low-viscosity military ordnance oil and ran it slowly down the steel threads of the cap. Grind, turn, release. The smell of the petroleum was dense, clean, and entirely empty of emotion. My hands moved frame by frame. A deliberate sequence drilled into my fingers during my first winter at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base. When you are responsible for the rescue hoist on an HH-60G Pave Hawk, you do not look at the sky. You look at the grease on the cable. If the grease is dry, men die. I closed my eyes, the cold steel of the thermos resting against my palm. My mind went back to April of 2012, to a ridge 40 miles north of Kandahar. The air then had smelled of burnt magnesium and raw clay. 14 men from an army platoon were trapped in a dry creek bed, their ammunition stored in boxes they could not reach because of the crossfire. We had stayed on the hoist for 26 minutes, while the thin mountain air whined through the rotor blades. My right knee had clicked then, a sharp, wet sound as the tendon tore under the weight of a 19-year-old sergeant from Georgia. I was hauling into the cabin. I had not let go of the cable. I had not looked at the blood on his uniform. I had simply looked at the steel links, measuring the distance between the dirt and the sky. Now, in the quiet of the North Carolina woods, I took a slow sip of the coffee I had poured into the cap. It was bitter, slightly metallic, and perfectly hot. Harold thought I sat in this cottage because my body was broken. He thought the cane was a white flag. He did not understand that a soldier does not need to move fast to take a position. They only need to understand the terrain better than the man who is trying to sell it. Harold entered our lives 2 years after my father's memorial service at Arlington. He did not arrive with a storm. He arrived with a tool belt and a box of commercial-grade drywall screws to fix the sagging porch on my mother's house. He was large in the way that men who eat heavy lunches and shout over the sound of diesel engines are large. His voice occupied every corner of the kitchen before he had even taken off his boots. A house like this needs a man who understands structural rot, he told Miriam that first winter, his hand resting flat on the oilcloth table cover. Your late husband was a good soldier, I am sure, but military men do not build for longevity. They build for the next inspection. I build for the winter. Miriam, whose life had been a long sequence of waiting for deployment letters and letters from the Department of Veterans Affairs, looked at him the way a person who has been lost in the woods looks at a gravel road. She did not see the arrogance. She saw the predictability. Within 6 months, his name was on the mailbox. Within 12, his son, Richard, had moved his truck and his hunting dogs into the gravel driveway. I want to be precise about something, because it took me a long time to understand it myself. Harold never plotted against me. That was the strange part. A man has to see you before he can plot against you. And Harold had never once seen me. He saw a government stipend and a bad knee. The cabin was never a blade he raised at my throat. It was only square footage standing between him and a debt he had buried in his own concrete yard. The wound he kept pressing was older and simpler than money. He had decided, that first winter, exactly how much I was worth, and every month after, he made certain I heard the figure out loud. The contempt was quiet at first, like the slow leak in the roof over the guest bedroom. It started with the coat rack, my father's old intermediate-weight leather flight jacket, the one with the salt-stiffened sheepskin collar, and the faded patch from the 23rd Special Tactics Squadron, had hung on the third brass hook near the front door since 1989. One Friday evening, when I came down from Fort Campbell for a 48-hour leave, I found it missing. "It is in the garage trunk," Harold said, not looking up from his plate of meatloaf. He was using a butter knife to score his potatoes into perfect squares. "Guests do not need the museum tour when they walk in. It looks cluttered." "Martha, this is not a VFW post." My mother kept her eyes on her water glass. I did not argue. I went out to the garage, where the air smelled of stale gasoline and lawnmower oil, lifted the jacket from the plastic bin, and carried it to my truck. To Harold. I was an obedient daughter who knew her place. To anyone who had ever stood in a briefing room with me, I was clearing the equipment from a position that had already been compromised. By the third year, the contempt had moved from the house to the table. We were celebrating Richard's promotion. We are to junior partner at Harold's contracting firm. The neighbors from across the cove had brought over 2 pecan pies, and Harold had cracked open a bottle of mid-shelf bourbon. "Martha there did 20 years with the government," Harold announced, pointing his fork toward my end of the table where I sat, with my legs stretched out to ease the throbbing in the patella desk work, mostly. Filing those federal requisitions out in Colorado. The Army loves its paperwork. If you need a form filled out in triplicate, she is your girl. Richard smirked, leaning back so his chair legs cleared the pine floor. "Hey, someone has got to keep the coffee warm for the guys who fly the helos, right?" "I let them believe it," I murmured into my napkin. The truth was 64 miles away, locked in a climate-controlled vault at Pope Field, where my name was attached to 47 separate combat rescue reports. Reports that detailed exactly how many minutes we spent hovering over 3-digit coordinates, while rocket-propelled grenades clipped the rotor blades, waiting to haul out boys who looked exactly like Richard, before they bled through their body armor. But Harold did not need to know that. A man who believes you are weak will always tell you his plans. A man who thinks you are a secretary will leave his ledgers on the kitchen counter while he goes to the bathroom. And Harold's ledgers were very interesting. Over 3 years, the automatic transfers from my mother's survivor benefit account had begun to shift. Every second Tuesday, $1,200, paid to a company called Hellbrook Development. 3 years, 36 months, $1,200 every second Tuesday, $43,200. Drained one quiet withdrawal at a time. He was not building a war chest to break us. He was robbing my mother to patch a $42,000 hole in his concrete yard. Loud men always take exactly what they need to cover their last mistake. They never think to take enough to survive the reckoning. Then came the line items for the Lake Gaston cabin, the property my father had bought with his enlistment bonus in 1987. A property that was supposed to remain in Miriam's name, until her heart stopped. "The cabin needs a new bulkhead," Harold told her, his voice rising with that practiced authority as he used his knife to divide a piece of steak. "Richard has got the permits. We will just put it under the company insurance to save you the premium." He shoved a 2-page document across the table. Between the salt shaker and the butter dish, my mother's hand shook as she reached for her reading glasses. "Do not worry about the fine print," Mom, Richard said, his digital pen already uncapped, his thumb already moving across the screen where the county filing waited. "It is just standard county disclosure. We are keeping it in the family." That was the night I noticed the Wells Fargo envelope, stuffed under the old cookbook basket on the counter. It was not a permit. It was an intention to vacate. To Harold. It was not even cruelty. It was bookkeeping. He was clearing furniture. The rain did not start until midnight on the eve of the auction. But when it came, it brought the autumn river swell with it. Water pounded the tin roof of my cottage, like loose gravel thrown against metal. At 4:03 the morning, my phone did not ring. It buzzed once with a 3-word text. From my mother's old burner phone. Blue Harbor. Gray. It was the distress code my father had taught her before his second tour in Desert Storm. It meant the perimeter was gone. I did not call her back. I did not check the weather radar. My training took over. Not hot anger. Not the frantic panic of a civilian realizing they have been robbed. The cold precision of a pre-flight checklist. I strapped the heavy neoprene brace onto my right knee, pulled on a pair of waterproof boots that had seen 3 winters in the mud of Bagram, and took my grandfather's brass-headed cane from the corner. When I reached the lake cabin at 4:30, Harold's GMC Sierra was already parked across the grass, its tires spinning ruts into the wet sod. The lights inside the kitchen were bright, a harsh yellow glare through the downpour. Inside, my mother sat on an overturned milk crate near the pantry. Her blue overnight bag, the one she had used since our trips to the Outer Banks 30 years ago, was sitting on the counter, its brass zipper split down the middle. Richard stood over her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his oilskin jacket, while Harold held a stack of manila folders. "The auctioneer is coming at noon," Miriam, Harold was saying, his voice rising over the sound of the rain hitting the windows. "The debt on the concrete yard is $42,000. If we do not clear the cabin title today, the bank takes the equipment. You want us on the street? You want Richard ruined because your daughter wants to keep a fishing shack?" "It is not a shack," Miriam whispered. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the small space between his boots, where the floorboards had begun to warp from the moisture. Her father built the boat dock with his own hands. "Her father has been in the dirt for 5 years, Harold shouted, his open hand coming down hard on the kitchen counter. A ceramic mug, one my father had brought back from a port call in Subic Bay, rattled against the tile and slipped over the edge. It shattered on the linoleum. The sound was sharp, like a small caliber pistol report in the enclosed room. I stepped through the door before the pieces stopped rolling. The rain from my coat dripped onto the cedar threshold. A small rhythmic tapping in the sudden freeze that hit the kitchen. "Harold," I said quietly, my cane hitting the floor once, twice. "Until I stood between the milk crate and his boots, you should have checked the weather. Loud men always behave the same way when the room changes." He squared his shoulders, his chin lifting as he tried to look over my head. "This is business, Martha. Family business. You do not have a dime in this house. Go back to your cottage." Training took over. Not anger. Training. My eyes stayed fixed on the manila folder in his left hand. I looked at Richard. He was shifting his weight from foot to foot, his thumb sliding nervously across the glass of his tablet. He knew what Harold did not, that an intelligence officer does not walk into a house at 4:30 the morning, just to watch the rain. "The auction stays," Harold snapped, turning back to the ledger. "We have got 30 buyers registered. The corporate listing went live at midnight." "Richard's listing," I said. "Richard's filing?" Richard's signature on a transfer for a house that was never yours to move. Richard's thumb stopped on the glass. I reached out, my fingers wrapping around my mother's forearm, lifting her gently from the crate. Her skin felt like dry paper, cold and thin. Get your coat. Mom, we are staying until noon. By 9. 14 inches the morning. The rain had slowed to a heavy gray curtain that flattened the surface of the lake until the water looked like lead sheet. I sat in the cab of my Ford truck, 30 yards from the front gate of the cabin. The engine hummed at 700 RPM, just enough to keep the warm air blowing against the glass. My grandfather's Stanley thermos sat in the center console, the green paint chipped and greasy from my fingers. I did not watch the clouds. I watched the odometers of the cars turning onto the gravel point. One white Chevy Suburban with the Warren County Municipal emblem on the door panel. Low-pressure street tires. 3 passengers. One black Ford F-250 belonging to Vance Land Holdings. Commercial plates. Customized steel bumper. Dual exhaust. By 10:45. The count was locked in my mind like a spreadsheet. 12 corporate vehicles. 14 private trucks. 3 sedans from the Raleigh Real Estate Group. Total registered capital idling on my father's grass. Approximately $3.4 million. I looked down at the paper ledger on my knee. I had spent 22 years tracking the shifting lines of mortar batteries in the Paktika province, calculating fuel consumption down to the last pint before a chopper went over the ridge. Harold thought a public auction was an emotional event. He thought the crowd would create pressure. He did not know that to an intelligence officer. 30 people in a room is just a target array. A black town car with Wilmington plates turned slowly through the mud, its tires slipping twice before finding the gravel path. I watched the rear door open. A pair of polished black Oxford shoes, thin soles, no tread, stepped into the red clay. David Sterling had arrived. He did not look toward my truck. He carried a black leather case with brass latches under his left arm. His umbrella held low against the river wind. I took one last sip of the coffee from the Stanley cap, screwed the metal lid shut until it gave a single, decisive click and opened the door down into the mud. At precisely 12:03. The living room of the cabin was packed so tight the air grew thick, with the smell of wet wool and damp leather. 30 people stood in a semicircle around the fireplace. Harold stood behind his walnut podium, presiding, his face flushed with the heat of the wood stove. Richard ran the floor. "We will start the bidding at $180,000, Richard called out, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the contractors. He gestured toward a man in a navy blazer near the window. The listing was his. The county filing was his. The transfer waiting open on his tablet was his. That includes the deep water dock and the full 4 acres of timber. I stood 3 feet away, my back against the pine wood box. My grandfather's cane hooked over my forearm. My mother sat behind me, her hands tucked deep inside the pockets of her old winter coat. Richard looked up from his tablet, a thin, sharp smile appearing on his lips as he looked at me. "Before we take the first bid," he said loudly, ensuring his voice carried over the murmurs of the contractors, "I want to clarify for the county records that the resident dependent, my stepsister, Martha, has agreed to vacate the premises by Friday. She has a small government stipend, so she will not be a burden on the new owner." A few of the local buyers shifted their feet, looking at the floorboards. Harold grinned, lifting the gavel. "Let us keep it moving." "Son, what was that first bid from the Raleigh Group?" "No," a voice said from the back door. The door did not slam, but the cold air that followed attorney David Sterling into the room made the fire in the wood stove flicker. He was 65, his hair the color of wet sidewalk concrete, wearing a dark charcoal suit that looked like it belonged in a federal district court rather than a lake house. He carried a heavy, square briefcase of thick black leather with brass clasps that had turned dull from years of rain. The room went completely still. The only sound left was the slow, rhythmic tick-tick-tick of the old battery-operated clock above the kitchen sink. Harold's gavel stayed 6 inches above the podium. The bidding is closed to late arrivals. Sir, we are already in the first call. Sterling did not look at Harold. He walked down the center of the room, the crowd parting for him the way people part for a state trooper at an accident scene. He set the leather case flat on the dining table. Right over the real estate flyers Richard had laid out, the metallic clink-clink of the brass clasps opening was louder than the gavel had been. "I am David Sterling," he said, his voice flat, dry, and perfectly level, representing the United States Air Force Judge Advocate General's Corps, and the estate of Master Sergeant Thomas Mercer. He drew a thick white folder from the case, bound with heavy green ribbon and a crimson wax seal that carried the emblem of the Department of Defense. He turned, first, to Harold. "Mr. Hellbrook, you are the architect of this. Hellbrook Development. The covenant you have spent 3 years working around. The survivor account you drained. $1,200 at a time. To fill a $42,000 hole in a concrete yard. That is your design. Start to finish." Then he turned a quarter step. To the younger man, frozen at the podium. "And you, Richard, are the hand that executed it. You built the listing. You filed the digital transfer. At midnight, you put a classified federal land asset, protected under the Military Care Act, onto a public auction block. The architect and the executor. The government will want both of you by name." Harold's hand began to shake, his fingers tightening around the walnut handle until his knuckles turned yellow. "This is my house. My wife signed the title transfer 3 weeks ago. Richard has got the digital record right here." Richard did not lift the tablet. He had just stopped typing. His fingers were frozen over the glass screen. Sterling nodded once toward the corner, where a Warren County Sheriff's deputy crouched over the old floor safe, the one buried for 30 years beneath the linoleum and the braided rugs. The deputy set a crowbar against the rusted iron latch and pulled. The metallic snap of the latch breaking was the only clean sound left in the room. A dense, mechanical thud that belonged to ordnance, not to family real estate. From inside the unsealed safe, Sterling lifted 2 things. The original covenant, sealed in 1994, under the same crimson wax, and a small gray plastic square, a vintage 7-inch reel-to-reel magnetic tape. He did not use a laptop. He walked to the old woolen sack tape player that had sat on my father's workbench in the corner since the Berlin Wall came down, dropped the reel onto the spindle, and pressed the mechanical play button. The machine let out a low, dry whistle, then a scratchy hiss that filled the dead silent room. "This is Master Sergeant Mercer," the voice from the speaker said. It was thin, distorted by 30 years of magnetic decay, but it was my father's voice. "Recording this at Pope Field, October 14th, 1994. The Gaston property is under a line of succession covenant. If I do not come back from the Mogadishu review, it stays with the officer who brought my boys out of the valley. It stays with Hades. No exceptions. New civil transfers." The tape machine clicked off, with a heavy, mechanical snap. The silence that followed was absolute. All I could hear was the low electric hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. Harold looked at me, his eyes wide, dry, and completely empty of the loudness he had carried since the first winter. Who the hell is Hades?" Sterling looked at him then, his face like a stone marker on a cold road. "Lieutenant Colonel Martha Mercer," he said softly. United States Air Force, Pararescue Division, retired. Harold did not drop the gavel. It slipped from his sweat-slicked fingers, bounced once on the podium, and landed in the sawdust below. His mouth remained open. But the loudness had left him. The crowd did not leave all at once. They dissolved. Within 4 minutes, the contractors had pocketed their clipboards. The developers from Raleigh had walked out to their clean white SUVs without looking back. And the neighbors had drifted down the gravel driveway like autumn leaves blown by the wind. By 12:15, only Harold and Richard remained by the podium. The walnut gavel lay flat on the cedar deck outside. They're forgotten where Harold had dropped it when the sheriff's vehicle pulled into the grass behind Sterling's sedan. I walked over to the podium, my cane hitting the pine floorboards with that steady, unchanging rhythm. I stopped 2 feet from Harold. He looked smaller now. The linen shirt was damp from his own sweat, and his shoulders had folded inward, until he looked like an old man waiting for a bus in the rain. How much was the debt? Harold? I asked him, my voice lower than the sound of the mist hitting the tin roof. He did not look up. 42,000. For a long moment he said nothing else. Then the words came out of him low and bitter, aimed at the floorboards instead of at me, as if he had been carrying them since the first winter. Your father's metals never poured a single foundation. His jaw worked. 40 years I built things that hold weight, bridges, pads, walls that are still standing. And people in this town still talk about him like he hung the moon. And they look straight through me like I am the man who came to read the meter. I just wanted, one time, to be the man at the front of the room. He finally lifted his eyes to mine, and there was no scheme left in them. Only a small, frightened resentment that had been wearing a loud man's voice for years. You were never the enemy, Martha. You were just the proof that I never measured up to a ghost. I know, I said. That is why you needed me to be small. I turned to his son. Richard, the digital transfer form on your screen. Open it. Richard's hand shook as he lifted the tablet. Delete the listing, I said, then pack your dogs. 4 months later. Hellbrook Development filed for Chapter 7. Last I heard, Harold was leasing a subcontractor's yard at a fraction of his former footprint. The kind of yard where you pour other men's foundations. For an hourly wage. Richard's digital ledger, the one he had been so proud to run, held nothing but late notices and a federal inquiry number. I did not wait for him to press the screen. I did not watch them carry their boxes out to the GMC Sierra. I turned my back on them and walked out onto the wooden dock where my mother was already standing, her blue overnight bag sitting safely at her feet. The wind off Lake Gaston had turned sharp, carrying the bitter smell of damp cedar and cold river mud. My mother sat on the old cypress bench at the end of the pier, her blue overnight bag resting between her orthopedic shoes. Her hands were motionless inside her coat pockets. Slowly, without speaking, she pulled her right hand out. Her fingers were stiff from the damp air, her knuckles thick and red. She held a small piece of yellowed newsprint, no larger than a standard index card. The edges were jagged, cut 30 years ago with her sewing shears, and the crease down the center was reinforced with 3 layers of yellowed Scotch tape. She held it out to me. I took it, my thumb avoiding the oily spot where her fingers had held it for decades. It was a clipping from the Air Force Times, dated August of 2012. There was a grainy, black and white photograph of an HH-60G helicopter hovering over a line of ragged poplars. The caption beneath listed no names, only the commendation for the lead rescue specialist during the extraction at Korengal. The text mentioned a Bronze Star with Valor, topped awarded to a detachment liaison from Seymour Johnson. Your father called me from the logistics office. Before they went over the ridge that morning, she whispered. He told me the unit was trapped. He said the army was not sending anyone because the clouds were too low. Then he said, "Do not worry, Miriam, Hades is on the rope." That is all he said. I did not smile. I did not hand the paper back to her right away. I folded it once along the old crease, the dry fiber of the newsprint ticking against my palm. "I knew," I said. "I know you knew," she said, looking out at the gray water where a solitary loon had just submerged without a splash. "But I wanted you to know that the house never belonged to Harold. It belonged to the rope." Most people spend their lives believing that the loudest voice in the room owns the truth. They believe that because a man can shout, he can control the structure of a house, or the destiny of the people inside it. They mistake the quietness of those who survive for the silence of those who have given up. But they are wrong. The steady ones do not look for victory. They do not plan schemes. And they do not spend their nights looking for a way to get even. They simply outlast the noise. They stand in the room like steel pillars in an old barn, letting the weather hit the roof until the wind finally clears the air. If you are watching this today, and you are sitting at a table where someone is trying to make you feel small, someone who thinks your endurance is a sign of your weakness, remember this. The truth does not need to shout to destroy a lie. It only needs to stay standing. If there is someone in your life who served quietly, someone who carried the weight while louder voices took the attention, do not wait for the auction to find them. Call them today. And if this story meant something to you, I hope you will share it with someone who may need this reminder today. The sealed letter my father left behind did not create my dignity. It simply revealed who had been holding the line the entire time. Hades did not mean death. It meant bringing the people you love back from the dark, even when they have forgotten the way home themselves.